We're delighted to have our guests with us here today, and today's seminar is being sponsored by the Norman Lear Center, and so the director of the Norman Lear Center, Professor Marty Kaplan, will be the ones to introduce our guests. Welcome.
You don't always get a crowd this good in this room, so you're hot. Thank you all for being here. For those of you who don't know the Norman Lear Center, there's a brochure on this table and in the back. Please help yourself and find out about it. I'm very, very glad that our guests can be here today for any number of reasons. One is I'm a huge fan of a book of theirs which has just come out and which you can actually purchase at the end of this event. Is that okay? Is that good on play? Makes it fun. Good holiday gift. The reasons that I am happy also include the fact that you have in our two guests a combination which is relatively rare and very exciting when it exists. Bob McChesney is a professor of communication at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has written, 24 books in 5 languages. And John Nichols is the Washington correspondent for The Nation magazine and also associate editor of the Capital Times, which is published in Madison, Wisconsin. What makes them so exciting to me is the fact that in addition to doing that, they also do a number of other things in the realm of putting their time and muscle and energy where their minds and mouths are, trying to reform communication and institutions in the United States. They are co-founders of an organization called freepress.org. If you don't know Free Press, I urge you to find out about it. I just got an email from Free Press, and it says,
you owe them money.
Pay your dues. It says, why America's telecom system stinks. So, I am proud to serve on the board with them at Free Press. It's very exciting to see scholarship and activism come together. They have lots to say. I don't need to say any other words except to ask you please to welcome them and John Nichols to be here. Thank you.
Let us speak from here. I don't know where I'm speaking.
Yeah,
okay, that's good stuff. Marty Kaplan, the only guy who looks better than his picture of him. The rare moment. He's passing up the act here. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. If you like those emails that you get, then you made a really smart move when you got Russ Newman into the room, who was Free Press's great innovator on how to use all sorts of research records. Well, yeah, I know, but I mean, he's the guy who started all this good thinking so long ago, and one of our great colleagues, and now you're at Free Press. Californians meet their applause out carefully because it may affect the whole celebrity culture, but in the Midwest, where we come from, we applaud for just about anything. There aren't that many of us, and we don't know when we might run into somebody again. So, very good to be here. Very good, and what a great, good crowd. And you know, one of the fascinating disconnects as we have this great dialogue about the future of journalism, by the way, just to fill in the blank here, is a future. No doubt about that. It's just a question of whether anybody's going to be paid. But in this great dialogue about the future of journalism, when we go to Washington, D.C., and Bob and I do this a lot, and we meet with the key players at the federal level, at the Federal Trade Commission, which is looking into this in a great many ways, at the Federal Communications Commission, with members of Congress, with members of the administration, they always say, well, we absolutely know, without a doubt, there is a crisis. We know that there is exceptionally serious issues in play. No doubt about that. But does anybody in America care about it? Because we're pretty sure everybody in America is, really dumb and really disinterested, and if they're doing anything, they're at a tea party. But heaven forbid that they would be interested in any kind of future for democracy as it might relate to journalism and communications. And it's events like this where we see crowds of people Many of them young folks who we would hope want to go into journalism and practice the essential craft of the American experiment. The only one outlined in the Constitution as honorable work. That, you know, we go back to Washington and we say, yeah, people do care. And it's not just at the Annenberg School or not with just the Norman Lear folks. It's also in church basements and union halls and community centers across this country. We have gone to no city in rural America, south of the Mason-Dixon line, New England, the Midwest, where we haven't had crowds of people out, and there is an absolute shared understanding, and that is that American journalism is in complete meltdown. Absolute, complete meltdown. No debate about that among citizens. We know that as we get into the academic class, there can be, you know, some debate. We don't know why, but it's honorable and certainly good. Maybe just the need to argue. But in America, everybody gets it. There's a universal understanding because they have to consume what we call journalism today. And there isn't much of it, and it isn't very good. We're best reminded, best explained perhaps by as always, by a Woody Allen film, Annie Hall, where there's two older women at a cafeteria in New York City. And the one woman says to the other, "The food here is horrible. It's the worst food I've ever tasted. It is as bad as the, you know, boxed up lunches at the Annenberg School. It's just unbelievably atrocious, awful food. I can't stand it. It's inedible." And the other woman says, "Yes, in such small portions." And that's frankly how America tends to feel about journalism today. Everybody complains about it, and they're deeply concerned that it may not be around. And the concern is legit. Last year, 140 newspapers closed. 140 newspapers, not, you know, the outliers or the losers on the edges. Major daily newspapers in Seattle, in Denver, in Tucson, in Albuquerque, in Kansas City, Kansas, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the home of the University of Michigan, a college town. A 150-year-old daily newspaper ceased to publish. It became the first major college town in the country without a daily newspaper. And again, we see this dynamic where the institutions themselves are disappearing. Now, that's not the scary part. The scary part is the ones that remain in operation, fostering the fantasy that they are serving the purpose of journalism in any realistic sense. Now, understand this. Newspapers across this country, and by the way, I will tell you why we talk about newspapers. Because, and maybe, I'm sure you folks know this, we have yet to encounter any audience that said to us that they got even bare level minimum sufficient journalism for their local, state, national, or international affairs, or anything that mattered in their lives from television or radio. We have not been nowhere where anyone who's spoken to tens of thousands of people, more than 60 events since January 5th, that not encountered one person who said, no, I am satisfied with my local evening news. I want more weather. And then I'd like some crime coverage, and then I'd like some news I can use because I've gotten fat sitting around watching the weather and the crime coverage. So we go to the daily newspaper, and we're not newspaper junkies. We're not newspaperophiles. We happen to like them a lot. We enjoy them. But it's because the newspaper is what historically and even to this day gathers a group of journalists together in a room like this and sends them out every day to try and cover a community. With some sort of accountability. As bad as a newspaper might be, there is a measure of accountability. It's at the end of the day, you say, why didn't you cover that? It's a hard thing to do with a blogger. As much as I've been blogging since 1999. I didn't know what a blog was when I started blogging. But you know, a newspaper has a responsibility to cover community. It is an institution there. So we talk about the newspaper for that reason. 140 of them closed last year. Last year, newspapers were laying off journalists at a rate and newspaper employees at a rate of more than 1,000 a month, every month across the country. In the last 2 years, we have lost 30,000 newspaper employees in the United States. 30,000 newspaper employees. And I will give you a measure of how disastrous, how absolutely disastrous the circumstance is. How nightmarish it is. Last week, I spoke to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, a very honorable group. People who actually have they've got skin in the game, as they say. They would like newspapers to continue to exist. And they have that wondrous optimism that can only be found, if you watch the movie Titanic, right? they're saying, maybe we'll stabilize. As the water's coming in, but it's possible. Maybe we'll you know the scene, right? The ship's up like this, and then for a second it stops, right? You think, well, okay, and then it starts to really go down. Well, that's the ASNE. It's a wonderful moment. They put out a press release last week at the start of their national convention, and they said, "Good news. Good news. Things are getting better." Last year, 5,800 journalists at major daily newspapers lost their jobs. 5,800 people in an overall pool of 46,000. So, I don't know math, but I think it's a significant number. 5,800 people lost their jobs. Good news. Good news. That was the year before. Last year, this previous measure year we did, it was only 5,200. And you're thinking, whoa, that's great. So it's sort of like the Titanic is going down. It was really going down fast, and now it's kind of at that slight slowing moment. And so put out a press release and say it's okay. There's nothing okay about the circumstance of journalism in America. Nothing is okay. And let me tell you why it matters. Most of the discussions that we have in a place like this are going to be about national affairs coverage, about how we cover the world and how we cover Washington, D.C. And I understand that. I respect that. I do a lot of that. But journalism, as the founders understood it, and journalism as the freedom of the press protection was written for, is a journalism that is in touch with people where they live, that covers their communities, in the towns, the villages, the counties, the regions where they live. And this is where the collapse is most exponential and most serious for our discussion. Because understand this, nothing we are talking about has to do with journalism, or with newspapers, or with media. Nothing. It is all about democracy. The only point, this is a trade school, this would be a trade school discussion if we were just talking about journalism for the sake of journalism and jobs. Now, journalism is a uniquely protected endeavor in this republic, and a uniquely respected endeavor in this republic, because the founders absolutely understood that it was the essential element for democracy. We take in all of our work 2 quotes from the founders. One from James Madison, the essential author of the Constitution. And Madison said that for people to be free, to have any kind of democratic operation, people have to be in access of, or have available to them, a great deal of journalism, a great deal of information, popularly available, not available merely to the elites, but to everyone. And it must be easily accessible, because if it is not, the so-called democratic experiment will quickly degenerate into tragedy or farce or both. As Madison said, a people who would deem to be their own governors must arm themselves with the knowledge, the power that knowledge gives. Because knowledge has forever governed ignorance. And the only thing that creates a popular democracy is popular knowledge, popular information. Essential concept, why they put the freedom of the press protection into the First Amendment. And Jefferson, a wonderful quote from him, said every generation needs a revolution. Why Jefferson? Some sort of we get this sense out of he's sort of a Gothic figure, because he was that wonderful other quote he had about the tree of liberty must be watered every 20 years with the blood of patriots, and you're thinking, wow, this is sort of like a Nightmare on Elm Street. And then you realize, no, this is what we call a metaphor. And what he was saying is that every once in a while we might want to pause and take a look at the republic and ask how it's working. Because we have popular information, is it functioning? Well, we've talked about all the macro here, all the loss of jobs, the collapse, the crisis. But let's telescope it down to someplace real, because again, it's this core community reality. What's happening at the community level? It's a great Pew study that the Pew Center studied one city, and I think it shows very, very well. It studied Baltimore, Maryland, a mid-level city that once had a great daily newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, still has that paper, but also has a full range of media institutions. It has weekly papers, it has papers for the immigrant communities, papers for traditional communities of color, it has a very rich television, all the network shows, independent TV channels, it's got a good number of radio stations, and it has an extremely active blogosphere. They have local news sites, they have bloggers who cover things. Now, the Pew folks studied what they call the news ecology. They tried to figure out where the stories, where original news stories in Baltimore came from. And they were extremely liberal in their definition. They even covered tweets from the police department. When the police arrested somebody, they would use Twitter to communicate that they've done a major arrest. And they even labeled that as an original news source in the community. So incredibly liberal, new media friendly study. Here are the stats they found. Just because, and I'll tell you, everything we say about Baltimore in the book, we see it, Baltimore is America. It's repeated city after city. But here's the interesting fact of it. They first looked at where original news comes from, and it was overwhelmingly from old media, from traditional media, that actually going out and getting stories to old media. Baltimore Sun being the primary source. But the Baltimore Sun, in the period of their study, was producing 33% fewer stories, original news stories, than they did 10 years ago, and 73% fewer stories than 20 years ago. 73% fewer stories from your primary source. And you'd say, well, okay, that's too bad for the Baltimore Sun, too bad for old media, but luckily we've got this internet thing, and all those tubes are working, and it's just a fabulous new thing, and it's going to fill the void. It's got to be filling the void. So they did all their quantification, all their study, and here's what they found. 96% of original news stories in Baltimore started with old media, newspaper, radio, television, primarily newspaper. 4% new media, and that included the police tweets. Now, those are your baseline stats, but here's the important stat, the only one that really matters for those of us who might want to discuss democracy. So they said, well, where do the stories come from then? What's the generation here of original news, original stories? There's two ways that people get information, right, in a news context. One way is that this wonderful woman here turns to this wonderful man here and says, hey, wonderful man, you have a notepad. My goodness, you must be a journalist. I'm so delighted because I live in a tough neighborhood. Things aren't so good where I live. And some of the kids have been getting sick, and I think somebody might have dumped some chemicals or done something bad in my neighborhood. I've called the city. I've called the corporation that has a big factory over there. I'm not getting any response. Hey, journalist, go out and check it out. That's your job. That's what you do. Because I'm a citizen. I have to actually work, put my kids to sleep, do things like that. I may blog a little at midnight, but it's very hard for me to call the mayor at midnight from home after putting the kids to sleep. And I actually was thinking of sleeping a little bit tonight. And so you, journalist, go out and do this work. You work in the daytime. You actually have a salary. You have maybe a newspaper, television, radio station, something behind you too that gives you a little institutional act. You can go in and speak truth to power. Go speak that truth. You find out this, you go to the mayor, you confront, you make things happen. That's how we tend to think journalism. Classic sense, coming up for the people, connected to the people. The other way you get information is when power decides what it wants you to talk about. And that's when a president or a prime minister or a college president or a CEO or the wealthiest person in town or somebody else says, this is what we want the discussion to be about. It is not going to be about those chemicals. It is not going to be about, whether kids are healthy or being fed or whether our community is functioning. It's going to be about what we want to talk about. It's going to be, we're going to frame the discussion. It's public relations. You use whatever word you want. Power coming down telling us what's going on. Well, they quantified. What they found in Baltimore was 86% of the original news stories during the period they studied started with power speaking down, 14% coming up as journalists. Now you say to yourself, wow, tough with Baltimore. Bad scene there, man. And then you think, well, we studied the whole country. In the book we have original research where we showed the transition of where our information comes from. And in 1960, in the United States, we had one public relations person for every one journalist. Roughly an equal burden. And we could hold them off. It's an equal match. 1980, it was 1.2 to every 1.2 public relations to every 1 journalist. Today, 4 public relations people for every 1 journalist. Now you think that, let's keep thinking of that Baltimore number. 86 to 14, 4 to 1, 80 to 20. You know, this is where we are headed. We always had public relations, we always had powers speaking to us, we always had official sources. But they are more definitional today than ever in the history of the Republic. More definitional today than ever in the history of the Republic, because journalism is leaving the field, creating a void. New media not filling that void. Power stepping in and framing our discourse with a little bit of Tiger Woods on the side. And if George Orwell came back and said, hey, I'm going to write about this 21st century. 84, that's ancient history. I'm going to write about 21st century America. What am I going to write about? You look around and say, what a joker I was. I thought the really scary thing was Big Brother is watching you. I didn't understand. The really scary thing is you are watching Big Brother. 24/7 news programs filled with weather, crime, a little bit of news you can use, but very little information that has any relevance to you as a small d Democrat citizen in the Republic. That is power, and it's most powerful. They don't even have to push you around. They don't have to tell you what to do. They just define the discussion so overwhelmingly that there is no discussion. And there is mass ignorance, mass disengagement, and a dysfunction that, I'm not going to go too far into this, but if you want to talk about, what does everybody talk about in America? They say, wow, we just can't get along, we can't talk, things aren't working, all these crazy ideas, Obama's born in Kenya, and it's all this. Well, with all due respect, it ain't that hard to explain. We're living in a zone now where the underpinnings of our democratic discourse are being kicked out from under us. And we have to do something about it. We take as our subtitle for the book, The Media Revolution That Will Begin the World Over Again. That's a quote from the journalist who called America into being, Tom Paine. And we remind people that Paine said a moment of crisis is a moment of opportunity. It's the best thing that a radical Democrat, radical is a good word, that a radical Democrat, small d, Democrat, can ask for. It's a moment of crisis when you can address fundamental problems. The crisis of journalism, which is a crisis of democracy, is a Paineite crisis, and we are in a Paineite moment. It is an opportunity for us to begin the world over again. But we have to move quickly and intelligently with small d democratic purposes. Not merely to save journalism or newspapers or media, but to save democracy. It is that fundamental a moment. So you ask yourself, well, who are we going to turn to give us some ideas? Where are we going to go? And I think to myself, if I could have a wingman in this struggle, if I could have somebody at my side, I would want to have a noted media scholar who actually understands media systems and how it works. A guy who's won just about every award and every honor for his scholarship in the area, and yet, while he's a brilliant academic, is also a highly engaged citizen. I would want someone like my friend Bob McChesney. Please welcome Bob.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's a great audience, and it's when we first scheduled this tour last fall. I first contacted Marty and Larry, and the first time we were going to come out here was during your spring break, I think it was. And we hold Southern Cal in such high esteem that we scheduled our tour to come to LA now so we get to meet with you. Because over the past 2 decades, Southern Cal has become really the center of research on the issues we talk about in this book. Jeff Cowan, Professor Westphal here. I don't know if he is. The work on subsidies, Geneva Overholser, Larry, Marty, the center. It's really the place where the action is in this country. And so we knew if we were coming to LA, we had to make sure we made a stop here. It also reminds me, this is the very first place I came. The first time I've been here in 24 years was the very first conference I went to as a graduate student. I don't think any of the faculty here were here 24 years ago. There's been a complete turnover of the roster. Ev Rogers was running the program at that point. And what I remember, I was living in Seattle at the time, and I hadn't spent any time in Southern California. And I was here for 3 days. We were in this building for 3 straight days. And then we got to go out briefly, And every time we'd walk outside, I was the only one from Seattle in the group. I'd always say, wow, man, what a great day it is. Whoa, we guys really hit the jackpot today. Finally, on the third day, this guy pulls me aside and said, wow, you understand, it's always like that. No, it's a great day. So it was an eye-opening experience being here 24 years ago. And when John and I wrote this book, we wrote it for a number of reasons. But the primary reason was that we saw this crisis taking place, and we saw a great deal of despondency, sort of a feeling of powerlessness to do anything about it. And we also saw a lot of unbased wishful thinking that either technologies or some magical market mechanism would appear that would solve the problem for us and we wouldn't have anything to worry about. And we saw no evidence to justify, we saw plenty of evidence to justify the initial concern, not much evidence to justify what we thought were faith-based solutions. And so what we wanted to do was say, well, how should we really think about this? Well, is this really such a fundamental problem? We simply cannot have journalism in our society anymore. And we came to the conclusion that the real crisis was not the disintegration of newsrooms and the collapse of journalism. The real crisis was our ignorance of our own history and of democratic theory that prevented us from seeing that this is actually a very easy problem to solve in a certain fundamental sense. There are details that need to be worked out that aren't easy. But in a certain fundamental sense, the answer is there. The solution to the crisis is large, significant, and enlightened public subsidies. It's the only solution to it. There's no other way around it in our view. And the thing that prevents most Americans from seeing this is the mythology that our media system has always been the province of the private sector, of Wall Street, of business interests. And if they can make money doing journalism, we get journalism. If they can't make money doing journalism, well, tough luck, no journalism. Roll up the carpet, call up, see if King George has any relatives looking for a job, and just abandon ship. We can't have self-government. It's too bad, because Wall Street is, of course, the place it has to come through. We can't have democracy without Wall Street. And, being enough of this story, and I said, that's a funny way. I wonder if that's how they talked about it back in 1789. That was sort of the vision they had for whether you get democracy is whether someone can get rich doing journalism. So it didn't really square with my understanding of American history. And what we discovered was there's a very different way we should look at journalism, and we should understand it. Once we understood it that way, everything came into focus. Once you got rid of the myth that journalism was naturally a commercial enterprise, that the market would provide sufficient quantity and quality, I think we came to understand the best way to think of journalism is what economists call a public good. A public good is something that society desperately needs and requires, but the market cannot produce in sufficient quantity or quality. It's really that simple. And people cannot use the marketplace to express their desires for it sufficiently. And journalism is really a classic case in our view of a public good. I mean, the examples that economists use of public goods are things like national defense, public education, parks, basic academic research. In the case of national defense, if you turn it over entirely to the market, it wouldn't work. It'd be fiasco. Our journalist friend here, he lives in the block with you, and you pay for Halliburton to defend you from foreign attack. You're going to say, well, if Halliburton can't attack him, I'm going to get a free ride. I'm not paying for it either. I'll let him pay for the defense of our block. And then you find out she's free loading. You say, well, screw that. At least you can pay next year. And pretty soon no one pays. You get invaded. You lose your country. And you say, that wasn't a very smart idea to leave it to the market to provide national defense. Let's have the government collect the money and defend everyone. You can't really break it down in consumer units. Another classic example that is pertinent for Southern Cal in our discussion is basic research. The market's very good at applied research, taking research from the 2-yard line into the goal. It's very bad at getting you to the 2-yard line, so there's no material incentive to get you to the 2-yard line. The internet's a classic case of what comes from applied, from public monies. The internet, the digital revolution would not exist without public expense. The market had no interest in the internet for decades. It was all a public expense. That's the basic truth of basic research. It's a public good. Now, the public good nature of journalism in the United States has been masked for the past 100 years or so because of the significant role advertising came to play to provide between 60 and 100% of the revenues that supported news media since the late 19th century. And until quite recently, it looked like the market was doing a bang-up job giving us all the journalism we could possibly want. We might have quibbled about the quality of it. I certainly did. But we could bellyache about the quantity of it. There was plenty of it. The market was providing sufficient resources. Well, now I think we can see as the dust is slowly beginning to clear that era of market-sufficient journalism based on advertising is ending. It's in the process of collapsing. But that was an anomalous era. That wasn't the rule. That was the exception. Advertising, as we move to a digital era, no longer has any need to go support journalism to accomplish its commercial ends. It has thousands of other options, often not even including attaching itself to editorial content to accomplish its commercial ends. The immediate thing we've all seen is the complete elimination of classified advertising to daily newspapers. $20 billion in just a few years disappeared. And why should someone want to sell their piano have to support journalism? It was purely a coincidence. There was no logical reason for it. And it's not coming back, nor should it. Nor should it. It doesn't make any sense. So now that advertising is going, we're back to the point where we were prior to 100 years ago, or 120 years ago, where there isn't sufficient money to give us the journalism we need. The public good nature of journalism is emerging, or returning, becoming clearer and clearer. And this is where I think we need to go to the origins of journalism in the United States and see what happened in the United States. Because if advertising only really developed in the late 19th century, and in our book we actually go year by year showing the increase in the amount of advertising from 1865 till World War I. If it didn't, how did we have such a vibrant and astonishing journalism in this country? The most strongest, most incredible print media in the world by far between 1790 and 1870. How do we have that if there wasn't advertising footing the bill? It must have been the magical marketplace, we're told. But in fact, what we discovered in our research was that it was due primarily to extraordinarily massive public subsidies. That was the launch-off figure for our great print media, the first 100 years of American history. And what we discovered in our research was that the real free press of the tradition in the United States has two components, not one component. The first component we're all familiar with, and it's a very important one, is the idea the government should not censor news, should not censor journalism, it shouldn't register journalists, it shouldn't interfere with the editorial product. And we certainly all agree with that. That is an inviolable principle that cannot be abridged. It's foundational to a free press. But the second principle that was equally fundamental and seen as complementary by the founders, by Jefferson, by Madison, was that the first duty of the democratic state is to make sure you actually have a fourth estate that can't be censored. If you don't have a fourth estate, in the first place, the right to not have it censored is sort of a meaningless right, a hollow right. It's like, I have the right to play in the NBA. It's not happening. So it's really a meaningless right. So the founders didn't see those as contradictory values. They saw them as highly complementary and necessary for each other. You had to create a free press in order to have a free press, and then you couldn't have any government censorship of it. And that's how they viewed it. And in the book, we chronicle research other scholars have done, and we've done our share as well, of the extraordinary subsidies of journalism in the United States from the founding of the Republic deep in the 19th century. These subsidies continue to the present day. Professor Kahn, Professor Westphal, and your team as researchers, you have many scholars here, and are working and chronicling how important these subsidies have been, though less well known and less appreciated, right through to the present day. And one of the crises we have today, as Professor Kahn explained to the Federal Trade Commission last month, is that those subsidies have diminished in the last generation, which has put our news media in an even more difficult position. But in the first 75 or 100 years of American history, these subsidies were astronomical. There's no other word for it. And the most important subsidy of all by far was the post office subsidy. The post office, basically its job was to be the circulation department for American newspapers for the first 75 years of its history. You're really deep into the 19th century, that was the primary thing the post office did. And the post office was an enormous institution. 80% of all federal employees as late as 1860 were postal workers, 80%. And what the post office did, 95% of its weighted traffic was newspapers. 95%, 70% of the units it sent were newspapers. Virtually every newspaper in the country was sent by the post office into the 1820s or 1830s, and the vast majority into the 19th century. And so the most fundamental question that the new Congress had to ask in 1792 is, since the Constitution required them to establish a post office, was what are we going to charge newspapers to mail? Well, today, of course, what we would think is, of course, the members of Congress were standing up, waving copies of Adam Smith's Well-Intentions and demanding that these have to pay full freight, you can't interfere with the market, these guys can't get any freeloaders here, no subsidies. That would be against the American free market tradition that Glenn Beck talks about. In fact, that wasn't exactly how it took place. There was a debate in Congress, an extraordinary debate, a loud, vocal, feisty debate. One extreme position was that all newspapers should only be charged 1 cent to be mailed anywhere in the country, and maybe 1.5 cents over 100 miles away for a newspaper. Whereas a letter would cost 12 cents or 24 cents. So enormous subsidy for newspapers, which are much heavier, much bulkier. That was one extreme position. The other extreme position, that of James Madison, was that all newspapers at all times should always be sent for free. Any charge whatsoever, Madison said, would be a form of censorship against the most dissonant ideas. And in a free society, those were exactly the ideas you had to keep alive. He was a person of the Enlightenment. That's where the truth came from. You wanted those ideas there. It was a social value, the highest priority to subsidize the most dissonant ideas and keep them alive. And that was the debate. These guys won. Madison didn't, except for one exception in American history, an extraordinary exception. In 1849, one class of newspapers got free postage in their area. You know, today we sort of say, of course, we know who that was. The big newspaper publishers in New York, Horace Greeley, the guys in Boston and Philadelphia, all went down to Washington with buckets of bourbon and wined and dined the legislators and got some cushy deal for the big shots. That's how America works. But in fact, it wasn't that at all. The group of newspapers that finally won free postage were the weakest newspapers in America. Weekly newspapers got free postage in their home counties. And you know what group of newspapers were all in that category? The abolitionist press. This was one of the core fights of the abolitionist movement, was to get free postage for their newspapers. Because their movement depended on the press. It was built on the press. It was an entirely a media-driven social movement in the North. It depended on newspapers. And without that subsidy, they couldn't exist. People weren't doing IPOs for abolition newspapers. It wasn't a hot money maker. It was a social movement, and they needed that subsidy. In our later research, we found out in the late 19th century, the populist movement flooded the post office with efforts and demands to lower their postage rates. Their entire movement to reach rural America depended upon postal subsidies, so they couldn't have survived. Their whole movement was job one for the populist movement in this country. So this was the real history of the post office. Now, how large were these subsidies? And we go into many other in the book too, including printing subsidies and a number of others. But we wanted to calculate, if the United States today, the federal government spent the same amount of money subsidizing journalism as a percentage of GDP as it did in the first half of the 19th century, what would it have to pay? And we went back and we actually looked at the original documents, because the post office did a study of this, fortunately for us, in the 1840s, so we could actually use hard numbers and see what it came up with. And if we had the exact same postal, the same federal subsidy of journalism today by the national government as we had in the 1840s, we'd have to spend $30 billion. Contrast that with the $400 million we spend on all forms of public broadcasting at the federal level, so 75 times more. That's what we spent. And that's one of the great crowning achievements of American history, was that we really had this vision of a press. All other national governments at that time, all they did was police work, terrorists, military. That's what governments did. That's what they regarded. We were the first government that said, hey, let's use the government to actually create democracy and build a free press. That was our crowning achievement, something we should be very proud of. Now, of course, a lot of people say, well, that's ancient history. You know, that was back then. They didn't have football. You know, they didn't have pizza parlors. You know, the founders were weird. They were almost French. that stuff doesn't apply today. No doubt the Supreme Court has revisited the matter and straightened things out and explained, no, now freedom of the press refers to Wall Street's ability to make money. So let's take a mulligan on the 19th century. That doesn't count. So John and I went back and reread all the great First Amendment decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court in the 20th century dealing with freedom of the press. And I assume some of the students in here have done them. And I've read them in graduate school. And the words we saw then didn't even faze me in graduate school because we had a vibrant press system, so they just sort of didn't pay any attention to them. But what we discovered was, in all the great decisions, Associated Press in 1945, and Hugo Black's astounding decision, 1971, the Pentagon paper, Potter Stewart's extraordinary decision, they argue that the first duty of the democratic state, of the government, is to make sure you have an independent fourth estate. The whole system doesn't exist without that. It's not an option, it's a requirement. As Potter Stewart put it, the First Amendment is a structural requirement on the U.S. government to create a free press. A structural requirement. Now, back in the days when the market was going strong, hey, that was no big deal. We got that one covered. Thanks anyway, Potter. Now that the market is going out the door, it's checking out and saying we can't make money doing this. We're back to square one. We're back to where Jefferson and Madison and the Grangers were. We're back to the point where we're going to have to come up with money to create a free press or it won't exist. Now, at this point, people often say, well, in fact, they always say, not often in our experience, yeah, well, that's Pravda, and Pol Pot's Cambodia, and Idi Amin's Uganda. Any form of government involvement invariably is a short step to totalitarianism. And were that the case, we would be the first ones to oppose it. But I think that's not a very accurate way to understand the real options before us. Maybe Stalin's Russia and Pol Pot's Cambodia aren't the relevant countries we should be looking at. Maybe we should be looking at countries that have democratic traditions like we do, and civil liberties and constitutions and legal political parties and opposition movements and advanced economies. You know, maybe we should look at countries like, say, Canada, Britain, Ireland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, right on down the list, Korea, and see what they're doing. And what are they doing? And what we discovered in each and every one of those countries, extraordinarily large, massive public subsidies, national government subsidies of journalism. If we had the same per capita rates of subsidy for over half the countries I just mentioned, we'd have to spend between $20 and $35 billion a year for over half the countries I just mentioned. And even the cheapest ones in there would get us up, like Canada, would get us up probably to $8 billion per year, or $10 billion per year, to get some sense of what we'd have to pay instead of our $400 million. So then the logical question is, well, this is going to lead to some sort of, maybe these countries aren't really democracies. You know? Maybe they've got a little brainwashing. You know, these are not really free countries. And so we consulted a magazine called The Economist, which some people might be familiar with. Excellent news publication out of London, but with definite attitude. And its attitude is stridently pro-business. It's libertarian, but it's pro-business. But they have no truck with government meddling in freedom. That's one thing you can safely say about The Economist. Every year they rank every nation in the world in terms of who's most democratic, using traditional political science criteria. Honesty in government, transparency, voter turnout, ability to organize and be active, effective politically, civil liberties. It's called the Democracy Index. And John and I looked at their annual Democracy Index for the last several years, and gee, we found something pretty interesting. Guess who the top countries are every year in the Economist magazine Democracy Index? The countries with the very largest government subsidies of journalism and public media. Every single year. The United States well below them. Economist magazine, mind you, not, The Nation. So I said, well, wait a second. Maybe we have to be skeptics here. Maybe what happened is they muscled out all the private media and they're spewing this government propaganda in Norway and in Japan. And so people think they're democratic, but they're really, it's like a matrix thing. It's some sort of totalitarian dungeon. So we consulted another group called Freedom House. Now, some of you might be familiar with them. It's a group set up to monitor government censorship and harassment of private commercial news media. That's its primary mission. It is very much a pro-private commercial news media, anti-censorship group. As much as any group in the world, it's Freedom House. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And to give some sense of how sensitive their antennae are, all governments that are dictatorships or communists automatically go in the unfree press category. No questions asked. Even countries that have, to some of them, ostensibly free press with a very active opposition press, like in Venezuela, are put in the unfree press because the government says things that are critical of the commercial press, and that seems to have a chilling effect. So these guys are very sensitive. You need any sense of government hanky-panky, unfree press, right? So we have to, how does Freedom Press rank? They rank all the countries in the world every year on the basis of who has the freest private commercial media, the most lucrative, strongest. And golly gee whiz. Guess what? Guess according to Freedom House, year after year, the freest, most uncensored, most vibrant commercial private news media in the world are the same guys who have the highest public spending for public media and journalism. The United States well below them, 23rd last year, in fact, according to Freedom House, in terms of private, uncensored, ungovernment hassled private news media. And then finally, some of the research that's been done by Dan Hallen at Southern UC San Diego and Rod Benson at NYU, has looked closely at some of the specific subsidies in these countries to improve journalism in the last decade, and has found, I think, pretty strong evidence that these subsidies have increased the adversarial content versus the government rather than decrease it, that they've actually had the effect of empowering journalism, not intimidating it, that actually an unpaid journalism is more likely to be an intimidated one than journalism that has resources. So our point in the book, and where we get at simply is this is a solvable problem. We can do it. Once we understand that this is a public good, once we actually look at our own history, once we actually look at other democratic nations, we can do it. Now, it doesn't mean there are automatic, easy ways to do it. And we always have to be especially concerned with government involvement and censorship. That can't be compromised one iota. But it's a solvable problem. It is a solvable problem. And that's where our debate has to go. The good news I can say is that, and Jess probably had the same experience, in our conversations with people in Washington who are actually studying this at the FTC, the Federal Communications Commission, I think that there's been a rapid shift as they've understood the severity of the crisis and the implausibility of the idea that new technologies and new markets will magically appear to solve it. And there's an increasing recognition of the real history from both the work done here at Southern Cal and that others have been doing, like myself and John, that government subsidies are not something we should fear, but something we frankly need to embrace. Is playing a crucial role, and that they're turning the debate in this direction. And John and I think that the $30 billion figure we know scares the death out of people. We don't think it's that scary of a figure. I mean, if we were invaded by another country, we wouldn't stop, say, appoint a commission to study pretending to see whether we fight back. You fight back and you worry about it. Well, I would argue losing all your journalism is every bit as serious a threat to our republic as a military invasion. Every bit as serious a threat. And we should respond with the exact same approach as we would to a military attack. But this irony is that even without raising a single penny in taxes, you could just reshuffle some of the money we currently have and are squandering at the federal level and subsidize much of the journalism we need. It's really that simple. I'll give you one example, and there are many I could give. Currently, commercial broadcasters in the United States get their monopoly licenses to radio and TV channels. They don't have to pay the government for them. They get them, these monopoly licenses are extraordinarily lucrative because in theory, or law, they do something in the public interest they wouldn't do if they were purely commercial concerns. They're basically sacrificing profit to service, so that entitles them to free access to these government monopoly licenses. Now, for this last year, the National Association of Broadcasters, their trade association, calculated that the commercial broadcasters have done $10 billion of public service broadcasting that they wouldn't have done if they were just purely commercial concerns, because they want to earn those licenses. Now, I confess that I've been somewhat skeptical of their math in the past, and questioned whether 10 billion was, maybe zero was a little bit closer, 10 billion, how much they actually spent. But I'm a big-hearted man. I'm a madman on this fellow. So I'm willing to concede, okay, you're doing 10 billion, thanks guys. I'm really, maybe what we should do is we'll do you a favor. You give us a check for 5 billion, and you can forget the other 5 billion. You don't have to do any more of your wonderful public service. And then you've got 5 billion in your pocket that you can use to create jobs and do more of your wonderful programming. So yours is a win-win for everyone. So right there, $5 billion. What could we do for $5 billion? We do extraordinary things. We could basically have enough money through a number of different programs to actually have local journalism again in this country. Lots of local journalism, competing independent newsrooms, through public and community stations, through new media starting up. But I mean, that's what I'm saying. There are solutions. We simply have to understand it, and that's where the debate has to go. And thank you very much for your time.
So we do have a few minutes. Questions are welcome. Ed?
Gentlemen, it seems to me you're asking us to bail out a bankrupt Chicago millionaire who owns the Baltimore Sun as well as the Los Angeles Times, and both these papers have suffered. Why should we do that? Why don't we just, I'm struck, why can't we break up the networks?
You're going to love our book. You're going to love our book. Because what we start out by saying is one thing that we are absolute, the only thing that comes after our absolute defense of freedom of the press, that no censorship, no government hand telling you what to do, is our absolute faith that only an insane government would bail out the existing media owners, would give money to the existing media owners. That would be like giving, after the banks crash the economy, giving them money. That would be nuts. and they'll go out and just pocket it and do crazy stuff, and it would be ridiculous. So no, we say in our book explicitly, this money does not go to existing media owners to continue to do what they do. In fact, the only place where we even entertain the idea of coming near them, remember what we're talking about is supercharging funding for community public broadcasting, creating a Right for America or Teach for America program based off like Teach for America, Right for America program, where we take young journalists, put them into underserved urban and rural communities, particularly inner ring suburbs, do things of that nature. We do not talk about giving Sam Zell any more money to buy real estate in downtowns of big cities. But the one place we come a little bit close to them is we say, these guys are so bad, so incompetent, right? Literally, you give them a newspaper that actually still makes a little bit of money. The only way they make money is by laying off hundreds, thousands of journalists. They are completely incompetent. They do not know how to do it. And so we entertain the notion of perhaps paying them to leave. And you say, well, that's rewarding failure. Yes, please, if you will go away, I will give you, sometimes if I want at the ice cream stand, I want to spend some time talking to Bob, my daughter's there, I'll give her a couple bucks, I'll take her to some ice cream. And we do write in the book about the idea of having the Small Business Administration quarterback sales of daily newspapers, like the LA Times, to local owners who make commitments to do journalism and commit to their community. Get it out of the hands of those people. That's the only place where we'd even come near these folks, because they have already confirmed that they don't know how to do journalism and they don't want to do journalism.
John, I'm going to jump in just to get a few more questions. A question from a student. Yes.
Can you go into more of how you would distribute this money?
It depends on the program. I think the most important criteria you need is a transparent system that's an objective standard, so it doesn't require a subjective, you get it and you don't. The classic case is the postal subsidy. The postal subsidy that the abolitionist papers qualified for, so did pro-slavery papers. You know, it wasn't like someone had to cherry pick. You automatically got it if you met certain very clear criteria. And it wasn't until Anthony Comstock and deep into the 19th century that you had issues with censorship. And so it's doable, it's solvable. And we believe we should have postal subsidies now, too, something like that, where anyone would qualify regardless of viewpoint. It can be done. It's not an unsolvable problem, but I think the awareness and sensitivity to it is essential to make sure you can do it effectively.
In other countries that we choose to compare ourselves to, in many cases, do it quite successfully. In fact, Holland, for instance, has 5 separate public broadcast networks.
Yes.
Hi, you gave a very neat and elegant solution, but it seems like the problem in this case is much more political rather than economic. So, you know, it's very nice to talk about the money what would you do with the money. How the question here is, how far are we from actually moving to the solution? I mean, given the debate on healthcare and all the cries of socialism, it seems like this is a lovely dream that may never be achieved if we depend on people's reason to follow it.
Well, thank you for that. I don't want to, in any way, I want to say, you have done the duty of every event we've had. You know, someone has to stand up and say, against, while everything you say makes complete sense, you've won the argument, your points are appropriate. But against the reality of the current moment, why are we even talking about this? Because there is, you know, frankly, no hope for democracy in America. It's only a matter of turning the key at some point. We had the Citizens United ruling from the Supreme Court. We just had net neutrality undermined by another court. You know, realistically, it's only 15, 20 minutes before, you know, we're all hightailing it to Canada. And our argument is that perhaps it might be a good idea to try and, you know, fight it out here for a little bit, see if it's worth a try. We've gone across the country, as I said, to virtually every region of the country. We don't just talk to Annenberg School, we talk to Rotary clubs, and we talk to Republicans and Democrats and Libertarians and Socialists. I was at a Tea Party the other day talking to people. And what I can tell you is there's much more understanding that this is important than most of the elite discussion of it would suggest. And also, one of the next articles we're working on is actually a budget where we simply shift existing spending on communications by the federal government to address some of these issues. Let me give you one quick example. And I'm going to tell you also, I think we can build the movements. We do it. We formed a group called Free Press. We're very active on this front. Form the movements that can actually do this. But let me give you one quick example of if we didn't even get anybody to spend any more money. Do you know what the United States government spends a fortune on? The Voice of America. We pay out of our tax dollars immense amounts of money for a publicly funded service that covers the world. And it was started, you know, in rather nefarious circumstances, and there's a lot of people who say, oh, it's all, you know, propaganda. The fact of the matter is we meet with Voice of America folks. They come to our events, and we've looked at it. I'm not telling you it's perfect, but what I can tell you is, the amount of money we're spending on Voice of America, I'd like to have Voice of America broadcasting in the United States so that Americans can get some sort of filling of the void that is created as our newspapers have shut virtually half of their international bureaus in the last 10 years. So there's a simple shift. You know, that's a flip of a switch. And doesn't cost us more money. And there's a ton of other areas like this. One of the things that we're looking at right now is the amount of money, massively more than we give to public broadcasting, community broadcasting in this country, that we spend so that our federal government can figure out ways to lie to us. Right? We spend much more on government, public relations, video news releases, and things like this to tell us what to think. We'd like to shift a little bit of that money. You know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, we are not talking. We have grand, bold visions. You don't even know. Chapter 4, oh my gosh. But what I can tell you in the short term, is there are things we can do right now, and what blows us away is when we meet with the Federal Trade Commission, when we meet with the Federal Communications Commission, when we meet with people working in Henry Waxman's office, who's been turned out to be very, very good on this issue, and when we meet actually with Republican members of Congress who are particularly interested in the postal issues and getting magazines and newspapers out to rural areas, we find a web of interest and openings of discussions. We know we're going to win this one. We're not doubtful at all. It's just, we do need you to sign on and stop being so cynical.
In a moment, I'm going to ask Peter Monti to talk about the next in this series. In 2 moments, there's going to be a book signing outside. But for now, please join me in thanking John Nichols and Bob.
Our meeting next week, which is actually the last one of the semester, is going to be our own Andrea Hollingshead. She's going to be talking about her latest research on online consumer communities and the top 100 global book brands. So do come and join us again next week. Thank you.